Okay. Welcome to our program tonight. It's titled From River Falls to Peace and Conflict Resolution, the story of Dr. James H. Laue. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Tanya Misselt. I'm the director of the River Falls Public Library. I want to first describe our format tonight. We are broadcasting online on Facebook Live and on our YouTube channel tonight. This program is also being recorded for later viewing on Facebook and YouTube. For those watching online, I want to tell you that we also have an in-person audience here at the library. At the very end, we'll have a Q&A. I will come around with a microphone for those in person. And for those who are watching on Facebook Live, you can enter your questions towards the end of the program, and we'll make sure that we get those questions announced. So tonight we will learn about Jim Laue's groundbreaking work in peace and social justice, which started his formative years in River Falls. I have some artifacts in the back that I want to share for those who are here. There is, unrelated to this, but sort of related, there was a diorama that was brought here this week. It's a 1969 replica of a UW River Falls dorm room, and that would have been a year after Martin Luther King was murdered. The woman who created the diorama of her dorm room, her name is Joanne Beyer, and she created that, and we were able to show it tonight. We also have two yearbooks in the back. One is from River Falls High School from 1955, when James Laue graduated, and also from UW River Falls in 1969, where James Laue also graduated from the university. For Jim, graduate school after Harvard would soon follow, along with impactful work during the Civil Rights Movement, where Jim was present with Martin Luther King at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis when he was assassinated in 1968. Each experience influenced Jim's groundbreaking work in peace and conflict resolution. Our speaker tonight is Ron Laue. He is the son of the late James H. Laue, the youngest of his three children. Ron did his undergraduate work in Pennsylvania and his PhD in education and leadership and policy analysis at the University of Missouri. He is currently the senior assistant dean at the McKelvey School of Engineering at Washington University in St. Louis. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you. And thank you, Tanya, so much for that warm introduction. And I also want to thank the River Falls Public Library and certainly the community of River Falls for being interested in this subject. It's interesting because doing presentations like this allow me to do a little more research on some of the impact and the life of my dad and some of the influence that he had. So I certainly, I'm glad to share with you tonight some of the specific attributes of Dad's time in River Falls and also his work in peace and conflict studies. So this is a picture that I really like of Dad because it really shows how engaged and laser focused he could be. And the one thing about Dad is that he was extremely intelligent. When he could focus in on an idea or a cause, when he was passionate about something, he wanted to learn everything about it and make an impact, make a change for the good. First and foremost, he was very smart and certainly intellectual in nature. So really what I hope to do with our time together is kind of look at the different stages and the impacts of my dad's life. And what I would like to do is weave some of that into his River Falls experience, because I'm convinced after learning more about the path of Dad's life that there was some incredible influence during his formative years right here in River Falls, and also during his undergraduate years at the Wisconsin State College, River Falls, which is now, of course, the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. Of course, I do want to focus a little bit of his work and his time working directly with Dr. Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, After that time, he transitioned to a life of conflict resolution, looking at ways that we can further aspects of reconciliation and mediation to further peace in the world. This was a cornerstone of who he was. And with that work, he worked tirelessly to help create the U.S. Institute of Peace. And then I want to bring it back around for what it all means for us today. So a little background, there are the Laue kids. So that is my Uncle Don, the oldest of the three, my Aunt Ann, who lives in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then, of course, there is Dad. That picture was taken about 1946. So I would often talk with Dad about his time in River Falls. I did not grow up in a town the size of River Falls, so I was always fascinated to hear him speak about it. And he had such memorable and positive things to say, and certainly about how it influenced his life. But one thing he always used to say to me is that I remember my childhood as being carefree and loving and inclusive. It's interesting. I look back now and think that Dad could understand the struggles of youth. He could probably understand them now and the angst that come with the teenage years, but I was never quite sure that he could relate to them as much, because I don't think he actually experienced that as much when he was growing up. And I actually believe that that is a tribute to his time growing up in River Falls. His parents were Jane and Roy Laue, and they indeed welcomed everyone. He grew up at the corner of Lewis Street and Maple, right close to downtown, and spent a lot of time walking around downtown and being engaged in the community. And he often talked about how his parents respected all others, and they treated others with respect. And I think that was the first thing that was really ingrained in him. They walked everywhere, right? This is the 1940s and 50s, right? They didn't have a TV. My recollection is that they did not get a car until the 1950s. Dad was involved in several student organizations, including Cub Scouts and the marching band. In fact, engagement, I think, is kind of a cornerstone of who he was. And then while in high school, he served as a guide and an interpreter for a Hungarian student. That picture there on the right, of course, is his time working with the Boy Scouts. I think that picture may have been a little staged. They probably said, all right, start working on something that looks important. And the thing about Dad is that he took his instructions very seriously, and he wanted to make sure he followed them to a T. So there he is, even at a young age, very engaged, very focused, and doing the right thing. There he is right there, just a little to the right of that picture. I talked a little bit I actually interviewed my Uncle Don and my Aunt Ann for this presentation, and Uncle Don talked a little bit about how he was an interpreter for a Hungarian student. This is why this is important. So imagine the early 1950s, a Hungarian student was here in River Falls, and Dad was asked to be a mentor to him. And one of the things that was a memory of that time is that Dad was very quick to defend him if other kids were making fun of him. We know what the scenario can look like. This student obviously was different. He probably talked differently, wore different kinds of clothes. And Dad had this incredible ability to choose his behavior by what he felt was right, as opposed to what other people were thinking. I think that's a hard trait to come about. I think it's even harder now, but that tells you a little bit about the guiding principle that helped him determine who he was with being a guide for that Hungarian student. When I was talking with my Aunt Ann, she said the church raised us. The three kids and their parents were heavily involved in the First Congregational Church of River Falls. And this provided the opportunities for public expression in a safe place. That safe place, I think, is the critical piece here. In fact, I might recollect or postulate that isn't always the case for kids now. It's harder to almost recover from a mistake when we have the social media and different things that are following our kids all the way around. he participated in a pilgrimage fellowship every week. This was a big part of what the Congregational Church was all about. And I might mention that his older brother, my Uncle Don, who's living and maybe watching this, he was a big part of this congregation. He eventually became a congregational minister, one of the three out of the First Congregational Church. He also had influential role models, including the pastor Jack Murner. My Uncle Don tells a story about how they actually helped build the parsonage in the 1950s when Pastor Jack Murner came to River Falls. That aspect of having good role models, River Falls cultivated that for my dad. And I think sometimes we overlook the importance of having a really good role model at a young age, someone who can guide young children as their minds are in that developmental stage. And then people did from one another, and no one had to be on top. Everyone pitched in when it was needed. That also is a theme that came through in the interviews that I had and what River Falls was certainly like in the 1950s. There wasn't as much comparison then. Everyone did what needed to be done to do what was right. And I believe that there was a little bit less hierarchy when my father was growing up. There certainly was probably less comparison. A lot more comparison now, especially in the time of social media and looking at some of our Facebooks and Instagram chats. I had once heard it said that comparison is the thief of joy. And Dad was not into comparison. He was too busy trying to do what was right. This is a very fascinating story that I want to share with everyone. A very special thing happened to me just today. I flew in last night, and when I fly in, I do what I usually do when I come to River Falls. I go to Glen Park and I walk around the Kinnickinnick Bridge. And it was then that I was reminded of just how Dad was engaged and involved in the community. So earlier this morning, today during my walk in Glen Park, I came up on the community center there. It looks to be a relatively new building. And as I was doing that, I noticed the historical pictures that are there. This one stood out to me. I walked up to it, and I noticed in the lower left, there appears to be a picture of a baseball team there. Upon further inspection, I looked a little closer. I looked at the picture in the bottom right, and I am 95% sure that that is my father. My cousin Brad is in the audience here. Brad, is that? Oh, yeah. That is, I would need to figure out the year on that picture, but if it is in the early to mid 50s, that has got to be Dad. He participated in many different things in River Falls. I would really say that with his engagement, he put himself out there, and this is important. I think this also really shaped his involvement in the community, and his real sense of grassroots efforts is what really makes change. And by putting himself in the community, whether it was a sports team, whether it was being an editor for the River Falls Journal or elsewhere, he could make that impact because he was part of that community. What a wonderful find it was for me. Never seen this picture before, and I keep learning new things of where Dad was and how he influenced his time here in River Falls. So it seems that indeed an environment that River Falls created was conducive for growth. So keep in mind, Dad was incredibly smart, very intellectual, but there are plenty of people in this world who are very smart and intellectual, but they do not use those gifts for the good of others. And I always wanted to ask myself the question, what is it? What kind of environment was created so Dad decided to go in an area towards peace and conflict resolution instead of just doing things that were just beneficial for himself? What was Dad like? He was intellectual. He was curious. He was energetic. He never was afraid to question. Yes, he did challenge rules and policies in which he disagreed. This was a big part of who he was. He was also always 5 steps ahead. Sometimes we hear this about young children who are really smart. We love it, but sometimes they're hard to parent, right? Those who are always questioning, wondering why we're doing this. he had a desire to find ways to impact social justice in the world. That's what came out of this. And that was also evident in my example about the Hungarian student. So that's what Dad was like. What did River Falls provide? Productive outlets. All that energy that he had, all that desire to learn, he had those outlets to use to explore his curiosity in many different volunteering opportunities. But he was taught to be respectful. He never got away with being able to treat people in a disrespectful way because his loving family wouldn't allow it. And I think that really influenced him. The church that he was a part of wouldn't allow it. Everyone in River Falls knew each other. So if there was some behavior that wasn't correct, it would probably get back to his parents. But then he had a safety net for when he failed. And he developed those skills to be impactful. Sometimes I think having that safety net for when young children make a mistake, that it won't be like a permanent tattoo for the rest of their life, but instead they get to learn and grow from it. That's something that he had when he was growing up. Of course, he did have a loving and patient family. And I had mentioned countless mentors that he had. One of the most influential mentors was Bob Bailey. Some may recognize that name. One of the few African-American professors at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. He was a professor of sociology and very influential for my father going into sociology. So he graduated from the University of Wisconsin, River Falls in 1959, and then he moved on to graduate school at Harvard for his PhD in sociology. And he shared with me, after I prompted questions about how that happened, he was the one student from the smallest school who was in that cohort at Harvard in the PhD program. Most of the other students probably came from Ivy League institutions. But here's the key. Dad was never intimidated. He was too fixated on getting his education, doing the right thing, and he didn't have time to have what is now called imposter syndrome, or looking over one's shoulder and thinking, am I really good enough or able to do this? What are people thinking of me? Do I really belong here? Everyone else is from Ivy Leagues. I'm from small town Wisconsin. That is something I always really admired about Dad, and I saw that in different ways throughout his life. So it was during his time at Harvard that he got involved in the life of Dr. Martin Luther King from 1960 to 1968. He first became involved as a student. This is when he was working on his master's and PhD in sociology at Harvard. His dissertation title was Direct Action and Desegregation, I believe. Later, after he finished his PhD, he continued his work with Dr. King as a government official with the Community Relations Services at the Department of Justice. This was in Washington, D.C. Throughout his time working with Dr. King, he was there in Albany in 1962, certainly for the March on Washington in 1963, Selma in 1965. Of course, that's with the pictures of the famous Pettus Bridge and Bloody Sunday that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. Chicago in 1966, lots of race riots were happening there at the time. And then, of course, in Memphis in 1968. I really love this quote from my Uncle Don about Dad. He said that Dad was passionate about causes, and his personality was not intimidated about sharing those passions with others. Boy, could he engage and get you thinking about some of the injustices in the world. And his ability to really engage other people with these injustices allowed for folks to make meaningful change, whether in the local community or elsewhere. So a talk about my father is not complete without discussing the tragic events that happened on April 4th, 1968. That is the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. To set the stage for you, starting in February of that year, there had been a sanitation strike in Memphis. African-American sanitation workers were fighting for what you would expect: better pay, fairness, equity, better working conditions, better safety. There was incredible injustice in that particular job, and as a result, this strike happened. Dr. King had actually been there in March of that year, and during the Memphis sanitation strike, there was violence that happened. And I believe the National Guard was brought in, and there are some pictures from Memphis during that time. So Dr. King had been asked to return to Memphis in early April. He resisted for a little while. There were bomb threats. There were threats against his life. In fact, when he flew to Memphis, his plane was delayed because of a bomb threat that had occurred. Nonetheless, he did travel to Memphis on April 3rd, 1968. And when he got to Memphis, he went to the hotel that he always stayed at when he was in Memphis, and that's the Lorraine Motel. So King checked in to room 306 of the Lorraine Motel with his aides, Jose Williams, Jesse Jackson, and the Reverend Ralph Abernathy. There they are. This is the day before Dr. King was assassinated. And you can, if you look over there to the left of the, where it says the Lorraine Motel, I've actually put a box in, yeah, here we go. So if you can see, that is the corner of the Lorraine Motel. That is room 306. And my father and I visited there in the early 1980. And the owner actually said that used to be called the King Suite, because every time Dr. Martin Luther King went to Memphis and stayed at the Lorraine, he always stayed at that particular room. It was right in the middle and on the second floor. During a recent visit to the Lorraine Motel, the Civil Rights Museum, I got the opportunity to talk with a historian there, and she shared with me the occupancy ledger for April 3rd, 1968, and allowed me to take a picture of that ledger. And you can see that in room 308, it says James Laue. That is where my father was staying. Two above there, 306, it says Ralph and King. That is where Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King were checked in. And you can see just above that is where Jesse Jackson was staying, and others. This is part of the official museum there. And I didn't even know that this existed until I went and visited. So to see my dad's name there in room 308 is pretty remarkable. Later that evening, after he arrived, he was asked to give a sermon, a speech. And this was the famous speech that some of you may be familiar with, the I've Been to the Mountaintop Speech. It was later that evening on April 3rd, 1968. My father talked about an incredible thunderstorm that happened that night that punctuated the evening, as he said. Dad was at that speech, and you may remember some of the lines from that. Particularly, you can see where King says, "I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And Dad actually wrote a little bit about that in an excerpt that he had of right after that speech. He said that afterwards he talked with Andrew Young, and this is what Dad said. He said, "Andrew Young and I talked briefly at the front of the church right afterwards. I've never heard him speak like that," Andy Young said. "I've never heard him so pessimistic." Dad often talked to me about that. He said he almost felt that Dr. King knew something. Maybe he had heard something. He said later that evening he saw him sitting in his car waiting for a ride back to the Lorraine Motel. And as he put it, Dr. King seemed detached and pensive. Later that day, or later that next day, on April 4th, 1968, this day started like days of the civil rights movement usually started. And as you can see there, Dad wrote more about how Dr. King spent today, April 4th, in court and in a round of meetings. as in Dad, I have been on a round of meetings today like yesterday. James Laue wrote about this in a personal report from Memphis. He wrote that in 1993, and I have a copy of that 25 years ago, a personal report from Memphis. Dad wanted to make sure he wrote all this down. A couple years ago, we discovered this picture. We are not sure the exact date of this picture. There is a piece of me that thinks that this is during the meetings on April 4th. The reason I think this is just there's Ralph Abernathy and, of course, King there on the right. There's Dad kind of in the back. He did a lot of observing through this. And just by the age of folks in that picture and the fact that they were there together, that's what makes me think that this was on that day. Later that evening, Dad spoke about that time as well. And Dad wrote, I get back to my room just in time for the 6 o'clock news. Again, this is 6 o'clock in the evening on April 4th, 1968. At 6:03 p.m., just after the lead story of today's court proceedings, I was startled to hear a loud report. It sounded like someone had tossed a cherry bomb in the small courtyard outside our rooms. I heard Dad say that a lot. He said it sounded like a cherry bomb. He was surprised at how loud it was. He immediately ran out of his room. When he ran out of his room, he looked to his right, and Dr. King was laying on the ground about 10 feet to his right with a huge gunshot wound to his neck. Ralph Abernathy had run out of his room as well. Upon seeing this, Dad quickly ran back into his room and he grabbed a towel. He ran back out and he placed the towel on Dr. Martin Luther King's neck in an attempt to stop the bleeding. As he was there with Dr. King, he surmised that he should get some more towels because of the amount of blood and anything he could do to help Dr. King feel as comfortable as possible. He ran back into his room, and it was at that moment that I believe this famous picture was taken. You can see here, there is Dr. King laying on the balcony. You can see the towel right there that Dad had brought out. This is Andrew Young. Ralph Abernathy is on the other side. Jesse Jackson has not come up yet. Jesse Jackson was actually in the courtyard when the shot happened. And just to the right that you can't see in this picture is where Dad's room is. And interestingly, Dad would often tell the story that as he was running in and out, this is absolutely true, he stubbed his toe on this cart. And he said every time he cut his nails, he thought about Dr. King because he remembered stubbing his toe really badly on that and then later saw that. After Dad ran out again, we believe that this is when this picture was taken. And the interesting thing is that I recently went again to visit the Civil Rights Museum here at the Lorraine, and I had never seen this picture before. I saw it hanging there on the wall, and looking at where people are situated, the police officer is not there yet. While my dad's face is not facing this way, it can't be anyone else but him. And his kind of hunched walk is very distinctive there. And we think that is him when he's running to bring the towels. And you can see he's probably saying, I have some towels, I have some towels. Andrew Young is looking up. And then later, Dad would often point to this picture. This picture is from Life magazine. These were published, and we had a copy of this Life magazine, and Dad often talked about this particular picture. That's Dad on the right-hand side there, kneeling down right next to King. I actually remember these slippers from my childhood that Dad had. Dad hadn't been back in his room that much. He still had his necktie. It was loosened up, and he was trying to give aid to Martin Luther King. So these are some other angles of that pictures. So you can see here, Dad is kneeling. There is Dad. King is there. At this point, Jesse Jackson has arrived from the courtyard. You can see a police officer or a firefighter. There's actually a firehouse that was right next to the Lorraine Motel. So a a firefighter, police officer has showed up. In this picture, you can see the firefighter has kind of shifted to the other side. Dad is still right there, his necktie loosened, trying to do whatever he can to give aid to Martin Luther King. And Ralph Abernathy, it looks like he's actually stepping on the other side. You can't quite, this is actually Jesse Jackson right there, who was bending over next to King. Right after this picture was taken, an ambulance arrived, and this is taking Martin Luther King down the stairwell there of the Lorraine Motel. And of course, you can clearly see Dad right there helping take the stretcher down. So it's interesting. Dad told a story about how he was the first person to let Washington know that this tragedy had happened, right? No cell phones, no instant media back then. And let me just read an excerpt of what Dad wrote about after this picture was taken. He said, within minutes, still clutched by grief and disbelief, I was extraordinarily fortunate to get one of the two existing motel lines to call Washington twice. Eve Wilkins was the first in Washington to hear. Roger wasn't home yet. Roger Wilkins was my father's boss at the Community Relations Services, and he had talked to his wife. He called them at home. Not being able to get a hold of Roger, Dad says, so I called Attorney General Ramsey Clark and gave him the appalling news. How bad is it? Ramsey Clark asked. Pretty bad, I think, was about all I could muster. We talked further logistics for keeping in touch, and the Attorney General called the White House before the media did. So Ralph Abernathy, in his autobiography, described a white man on the balcony after King fell, and this is what he said. He said of Dad, he was frightened enough to be crawling on his hands and knees, but brave enough to bring a blanket to spread over Martin. And I remember Dad talked about that moment, that momentum, inertia, solving the problem just took over, and he didn't realize how much in danger he could be. The gunman could have been there to take out other people as well. So if you've ever gotten a chance to go to Memphis, or if you're planning a trip to Memphis, I highly recommend you visit the National Civil Rights Museum. And let me just tell you a little bit about how it's set up. So at the Lorraine Motel, essentially this incredible civil rights museum has been built on the backside of the Lorraine Motel. And a few years ago when I visited with my son, basically you go through this museum, and it gives fantastic interpretive data from the entire civil rights movement, from the Montgomery bus boycott all the way up to the assassination of Dr. King, and then of course to the present day. The way that the museum is set up is that as you're touring through the museum, you actually view the room where Dr. King stayed through a hollowed out area. So imagine, if you will, this room here is no longer, it has been hollowed out, and you enter it from the other side. Dr. King's room is here. Dad's room is here. And as what they've done is that they have taken out the wall and put glass there so you can look directly into the room where Dr. King stayed. What they have also done is they have taken out the wall and put glass in the room that Dad stayed in. Literally, when you go to this museum, you can see inside the exact room that Dad was staying, and there it is. When I look at this picture, and that's my son there, he's much taller now, but when I look at this picture, I imagine Dad coming in, turning on the TV for the 6 o'clock news, hearing that incredible gunshot, running out, and running back and forth between the door, which is over here, to the bathroom to get towels to render aid for Dr. Martin Luther King. Before our visit to the Lorraine Motel, our family decided to purchase a memorial plaque for Dad. And this is that memorial plaque right here. And it says, Dr. James H. Laue, or in memory of Dr. James H. Laue, and a life dedicated to peace and conflict resolution. And during that trip, I saw this for the first time, and the symbolism was not lost on me, because it's almost as if that brick is pointing to the exact spot that Dad was kneeling down. Again, this is Dad's room right here. That's the door. This is where Martin Luther King was staying. This is where Martin Luther King was hunched over. And that's the railing that Dad was holding on to as he was rendering aid. It felt very, very symbolic. So where did Dad go from here? How did that influence his life in conflict resolution? So Dad said, the King taught me that conflict resolution, a laudable goal on the surface, does not truly occur without struggle refined in love, and that justice is not fulfilled without reconciliation. You know, I do think that when we think about peace, when we are young in our life, we think that it's just about, being passive, being nice, and getting along with everyone. He realized that specific techniques could be taught in order to achieve peace and conflict resolution, true reconciliation, making things right after history of being wronged. And that is what he dedicated his life to. How did he do that? With the foundation of the King's influence and support of friends and family, James Laue transitioned into academia after the 1960s, while working towards the establishment of the United States Institute of Peace. So starting in the late 60s and onward, Dad had various appointments at Hollins College in Virginia, Emory in Atlanta. He went back to teach at Harvard University, then went on to work and teach at Washington University in St. Louis, which happens to be the institution I work at now. And then he worked at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And it was there at his time in St. Louis that he really developed the field of conflict resolution, right? He really started to study and research how conflict resolution is done, what are the methods that work, really having a discipline that is steeped in research and data, as opposed to just what we think is the way that we achieve peace. And then in 1987, he was asked to be the first endowed professor and the first chair in the field of conflict resolution at George Mason University. It cannot be understated how big this appointment was. So if you can imagine when a field becomes an actual discipline that is studied and a department is created at a university, fields like sociology and physics and chemistry and biology and anthropology and so on and so forth, you have to have countless scholars in the field doing lots of research proving that this is actually a field that should be standalone and it should be studied. And Dad, along with his work, he was chosen by George Mason University to be the first endowed professor to lead up this new field, this new department at conflict resolution at George Mason University. He was hesitant to move. George Mason University is right outside of Washington, D.C., and he once said that if I were ever to leave, I would want to be in Washington, because that is where the real change happens. So we moved. This was actually right when I was in high school. We moved from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., and his career continued to make incredible contributions to the field. And then later, in the late 80s and 90s, he was asked by President Carter to co-chair the committee to establish a national academy to teach peacemaking techniques. Again, this was a major accomplishment where presidents are asked to be the commander-in-chief, as they should be. Here was a president who said, we study war, can we find a place to study peace? So this is actually one of my favorite pictures. And Dad always used to say to me, and this always rang true to me, we have institutions that study war, so why not have institutions that study peace? And their dad is with Jimmy Carter. To the left of Jimmy Carter is Senator Matsunaga from Hawaii. He was also instrumental in working for the National Peace Academy. And then, of course, Dad is there on the right. This is how it happens, right? These are the meetings of how we actually accomplish creating an Institute of Peace for the United States of America. Dad worked tirelessly in this effort all the way up until his death. He went to speak at conferences. He did research. He wrote several papers on getting to the table and trying to figure out different ways to build momentum to create a National Academy of Peace. And let me bring it back to where I started, and that's River Falls. That's change at the local level. The River Falls community did indeed pitch in and do their support for the National Institute of Peace. Here's a couple articles that were written by members of the River Falls community. If you can see there, one talks about we need to help a local individual, James Laue from River Falls, who's working to try to create this Institute of Peace. The more that we can send our support to our state officials in support of this effort, then we will have an institute that studies peace. And because we have these efforts by so many countless people, then we have this. We do indeed have a National Institute of Peace. If you're ever in Washington, D.C., just north of the Lincoln Memorial and just west of the White House sits this building. If you look closely at this, you can see the outline of a peace dove that is the roof of this building. Of course, Dad didn't do this alone. He is not completely responsible for this, but so many of those who helped, he was a big part in instigating this process. So the lessons are as relevant now as they've ever been. So you can see some of the writings that Dad did. And I look at the dates of some of these interviews that were done with Dad, 1979, 1980, looking at peace with accepted techniques of conflict resolution. He talked about the local level. Notice the last sentence in that second paragraph. They're the ones who must take action on such things as criminal justice system, including the question of citizen review boards for police departments. This is a topic of conversation that is incredibly relevant today. How do we create that balance between making sure that there are checks and balances with police, and at the same time making sure that police are valued and are held with respect for the incredible, difficult work that they do. 1980 is when Dad said that. He was absolutely, it's almost as if he could see some of the future things happening. Of course, it was just the other day, the second anniversary of the death of George Floyd, and I am kind of reminded about some of the problems in society. They come full circle. But here's the key. Dad left River Falls in 1959, but it never left him. He would often come back to River Falls. He would speak at the university. He would go to different sessions where he led different seminars about teaching peace and conflict techniques. And if anyone happens to be in Hagsted Hall at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls, Dad is one of the recipients of the Alumni Awards. I want to say it's in the mid to late 70s of when that was. It's a very old picture of my son and daughter there, but he is permanently there at the University of Wisconsin as a distinguished alum. And Dad was the graduation speaker at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls, back in 1970. As I looked at the date of this, my mother, who's still very engaged and still alive and engaged, this was in May of 1970, just a month after I was born. I'm kind of reminded that in order for my dad to do these great things, my mother also did so many great things to allow that to happen. She was probably home at that time taking care of me as Dad came and gave the commencement address. Is hope hip? My goodness, we've heard things about hope. Again, he was ahead of his time, right? He wanted to make sure that we did not think that change couldn't happen, and truly they do. Change happens with young people, and that's what Dad was saying during this commencement address. Okay, a fun, quick story if I have time. I think I do. I think everyone will enjoy this for the fans of River Falls. So Dad had health problems all his life. He, at a very young age, was a diabetic. He had a pancreas transplant in the summer of 1993. I was actually in Washington, D.C. at that time. I was working for the National Park Service right after I graduated from college. And it was during that summer that some folks might remember that the Kansas City Chiefs had their summer training camp here in River Falls. Hopefully some folks remember that. Well, as Dad was home recovering, he read an article in the Washington Post that talked about the training camp location for the Kansas City Chiefs. And basically that article said, if you didn't know any better, you'd think that the town of River Falls is like Mayberry. And it was, kind of talking about small town life where the Chiefs are and these, great football players. Well, remember that part about when Dad gets a passionate thought in his head, he just goes for it? That's what he did here. He said, are you kidding me? These East Coast writers don't have any idea what life in River Falls is like, or what kind of intellectual opportunities there are. And so he took it upon himself to write an article to the Washington Post. And in that article, he said, River Falls is no Mayberry. Consider the university, our proximity to the Twin Cities. Every time I go to River Falls, I love going to the Falls Cafe, where I have intellectual conversations with retired faculty members, retired presidents, and those who are looking to improve society. That was Dad. I remember I said to him right after this, Dad, that's just a young writer, Washington Post, trying to be funny, but he wasn't having anything of it. He wanted to make sure he defended his hometown of River Falls, Wisconsin. So Dad died later that September in 1993. There were many different articles about the life and the contributions that he had. There was a dissertation written on Dad's work at George Mason University. Of course, he is laid to rest here in Greenwood Cemetery here in River Falls, where there's a long history of our family in the Greenwood Cemetery, and Dad has joined them. And finally, that is the picture of Dad that hangs at the university. And I guess I would close by saying the true love that he had of River Falls and his ability to have that outlet for his incredible intellectual capabilities allowed for those intellectual capabilities to be for good. There's so many folks out there that are incredibly bright and smart. If we can give them the tools to move that into a positive direction, I think that we'll be a better place as a society. Let me pause there, and Tanya, I think I'll turn it over to you. Is that the drill here? All right, very good.
Okay, I'm just going to step in view of the camera here, just so I don't sound like a voice from on high. So I just want to invite the audience to ask any questions. We'll start here with our live audience, and I'll come around with the microphone if you have any questions. We'll be happy to get them in here, and then we'll go to our online participants and see if they have any questions. Do we have anybody here who wants to ask a question?
It looked like in that hotel ledger there was another Laue listed. Is that true or not? And it looked like right below like Joseph Laue or something like this, or not?
Good eye. That was Joseph Laue, L-O-W. And interestingly, he was from South Africa, and he was the photographer. And why that is significant is he was there on assignment with Life magazine, and if Dad hadn't gotten back to the hotel when that was, if Joseph Laue had not gotten back to the hotel when he did, those pictures never would have been taken. We'd have no record of Dad being there during the assassination. So I'm glad you caught that. And he died as well, but probably just about 10 years ago. But he's the one who took all those pictures. So, yep.
Anybody else have questions? Do we have any questions from our online audience? No, I guess I have a couple things I wanted to say and
Sure.
then a question. So when I listen to you, of course, I reflect on my own life. My father was a sociology professor in the 60s in Tennessee.
No kidding.
And I was born in 1965. I do not remember Martin Luther King's assassination, but I do remember a little bit of the civil rights movement and some pretty nasty memories with my mother being, really devastated by some of the things that were going on. So I guess, now we're coming upon Memorial Day, and I guess my first question is, are you here for your dad, being Memorial Day?
That is part of it. Every time I come to River Falls, I go to his gravesite. His favorite color was red, and I always put a red flower there. So yes, I am.
So when we celebrate Memorial Day, we usually think first of our servicemen, but I think honoring the people who've contributed to our nation and our history is really important, and I thank you for your family's contribution to that. I'm happy to honor that tonight. So when my father has passed away too now, and I think he would roll over in his grave if he were to know what was going on in the world today. And I just wanted to, do you have any other specific thoughts on what your father would be thinking right now?
Yeah, so it's a fair question, and it's interesting to share with Dad and kind of how he would look at this. I do think that there is no one solution to the problems that we have. We all know what a partisan environment that we live in and kind of what that does. And I think that is a way that sometimes we can just say things are easy for a solution is clearly this or clearly that. I'd love to share with people that it's interesting. My mother was married for almost 30 years to Dad. Dad died over almost 30 years ago. My mother remarried, and my mother married a brigadier general from the military that she met in the 60s that actually my dad had met. Why do I tell that story? It's that Dad was not against the military or against police or against all those that disagreed. He had an understanding that there is kind of ways that we need to work together, and there are some cases where certain action is necessary, and there's others where real peace can be achieved, and that's what he wanted to do. Your question about looking at, society today, and I'd be remiss if I did not mention the horrific events in Texas of the killing of 19 kids. Dad did not live during the times of these mass shootings that happened, but he would say we need to start to think of more creative solutions and not just look at what happens, that anytime something like this happens, people fall into their camps of gun rights or not gun rights. And I don't think that's the way we should look at it. I heard a great example of maybe the ways that we can look at solving this particular problem. We have cars, and we are supporting people who have cars, but we also have guardrails on our highways to make sure that people stay safe with cars. Somewhere we need to figure out how we can have more safety for our children. Where imagine the kids today growing up with hearing, how do you explain to a young child that these things happen in elementary schools? I really think that Dad's development was so critical and so helpful because as a young person growing up, his mind did not have things racing at him too quickly that a young mind can't handle. A young mind cannot handle being inundated with Instagram images, comparing ourselves to others, looking at what else is out there, looking at the violence. I think that really makes things uneasy. I work in higher education. I don't have to tell folks the anxiety that our young kids are feeling right now. I think if we can step back a little bit and let youth have their youth, have them be able to grow up without being oversensitized to some of these challenging things, I think that's going to be the way forward to make some of this change and help eradicate some of the violence that we're seeing right now.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I've got at least one more. So, with the rise of white supremacist groups, at least in our nation, if not in the world today, do you have any reflections on why that's happening? Do you think that there's some forgotten history?
Yeah, boy, it's a great question. So sometimes I do get a little surprised at how predictable things are when our nation's leaders act a certain way, when a segment of our nation's leaders act a certain way, as if we're surprised when this happens. And I think that is happening right now. So I think that's point number one. Point number two is that there's too much coming at us right now with social media and the ability for folks to put anything out there that fuels animosity and fuels anger. I do believe in free speech. I do believe that we all are entitled to our own opinion, but we're not all entitled to our own facts. And I think sometimes facts, our opinions are put out there as facts, and that is what can really fuel some of the extreme white supremacy. And we've got to find this balance. We got to be very careful about labeling folks a certain way when they are not at the white supremacy level, that they're not at the violent level, but maybe have some different opinions. And then we have to really be careful about saying, okay, this is too much. This is not just free speech. This is hate speech that can cause violence. And I think we're at the point right now where we have to make that distinction. I think we can't say just anything. And back to my point that when you feed young children things that are not facts, there's a saying, when it fires together, it wires together. And that's what happens with young kids. When you get senses of violence or degrading other people when you're really young, you're going to grow up to be that way. And I think that's what we're seeing a little bit with some of the violence. So we got to protect our kids more. And I don't think that we're doing that as well as we could as a society.
Okay, we are almost at 7:30, so if there are no other questions, I will take an opportunity to wrap this up. First, I want to thank our in-person audience and our live audience, and even those who are joining us later by viewing this recording. Thank you for taking time to be with us here today. I want to thank our presenter, Ron. I wish I could know your dad. Clearly, you are a chip off the old block. So our summer library program starts on June 6th. And on June 6th, we have a carnival kickoff here from 4 to 6. I do have some brochures of programs that are coming up on the back table. Do want to mention one on Tuesday, June 21st. We have Jenny Calvitis and Kristen Whitson coming here to present. They are the authors of a book called We Will Always Be Here, A History of LGBTQ+ Wisconsin Activism. We are grateful for all of our patrons and hope that we see more of them this summer for our summer library program. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.